probably more or less class actions originate with class action attorneys who advertise for plaintiffs. And they do that the same way that brands look for customers, right? They're on social media too. And they're using analytics too.
They obviously don't pop up on my social media. Welcome. This is the Demystifying Cosmetic podcast, and I'm your host, Jennifer Cookson, R&D professional, industry veteran, and beauty enthusiast. Today, we'll be discussing claim substantiation with our guest, Avril Love, counsel at K&L Gates. Avril specializes in regulatory compliance and litigation avoidance for the beauty industry. With extensive experience advising clients on navigating complex regulatory landscapes, Avril provides strategic guidance to achieve balanced compliance while fostering innovation and minimizing risk. Her expertise in FDA and FTC regulatory compliance, combined with years of litigation experience, makes her a trusted advisor for companies seeking to navigate the evolving regulatory environment. Welcome, Avril, and thank you for being our guest today.
Thanks for having me, Jennifer. It's nice to be here.
Great. I'd love to start by learning a little bit about how you got into this area of law.
Well, it's kind of a long story, I guess, but I started out my first job at a law firm working with medical device and pharmaceutical drug manufacturers who were being sued by consumers for product liability issues. And in doing that, I got very familiar with how the FDA regulates drugs and devices. And then it was a really easy pivot for me to work in cosmetics, which are also regulated by the same law, by the FDA. And I started working with a partner, Roni Schmeltz, who was working closely with the cosmetics industry. And she and we've made a really good team. And for about a decade, we've been working together, serving the cosmetics beauty industry.
Great. So let's start with some basics. Is a claim?
Okay, well, if we're going to start with the basics, I have to start with some disclaimers. So I'm putting up on the screen here a presentation. And the information that I'm providing here is really just for general educational purposes only. It is not legal advice, and I am not forming a legal relationship with any of your listeners. Although if they want to call me, I'm happy to. But I also it's important to know that what I'm presenting in this presentation is just a subset of what you might need to know. And most importantly, it is a snapshot in time. So this information is good for right now. But in a week from now, or in a year from now, or in 5 years from now, if you're looking back at this slide deck, it may be obsolete and out of date. And so it's really important not to rely on it and to talk to a lawyer if you have a legal question. So then to your question, what is a claim? Anything you say to a consumer is a claim about your product. So it's really important to distinguish because a contract manufacturer can say things to brands about ingredients, or an ingredient supplier, right, can say things to brands about ingredients. A contract manufacturer can make claims to brands about products. And those kinds of claims carry much less risk than the claims that the brands then convey to consumers, because those claims that we make to consumers are much more regulated. And that's why we often can see all kinds of claims being made by contract manufacturers and ingredient suppliers that carry a lot of legal risk when they're made to. And claims can be anything that you put on your product labeling, anything you put online on your website, social media. In fact, even claims made by influencers or bloggers, people with whom you have relationships and who are speaking on behalf of the brand, those folks are making claims on your behalf. Even consumer reviews that you post on a digital property that you have control over, those claims might be made by consumers themselves, right? They're writing them, you're not. But you are still going to be held responsible for those claims that they make about your product if you are in control of the platform where they are posted. And in fact, even brands can even be responsible for perceptions that consumers have. So for example, if there is an ingredient that is a well-known OTC ingredient, maybe salicylic acid that's really known for use in acne conditions. You know, if you're making claims touting, just featuring salicylic acid is a key ingredient. There may be an implied claim there about the acne benefits of your product. So consumer perception is also something you need to think about when you're evaluating if you're making a claim about an ingredient or product. And I noted an implied claim. So there are two kinds of claims. You can have an express claim or an implied claim. And an express claim is obviously something where you're, explicitly saying something. Implied claim is less direct. It could be something that could be inferred based on all kinds of information that's presented, right? Not just the words you're using even, but also any kind of visuals, data that you're presenting. So for example, if you have a packaging label and you've got a lot of green that you're using on the packaging and you've got pictures of, fruits on there, you might be making an implied claim. For example, let's say you've got the wording vitamin C and you've got some oranges on your packaging, and then you've got a lot of natural looking imaging. There might be an implied claim there that the vitamin C in your product isn't synthetic, but actually comes from oranges, right? And so those are the kinds of things that you need to consider when you're looking at the totality of the claims that you're making. And that's what the regulatory bodies will be looking at when they're evaluating your claims. They're going to be looking at everything that you say all together on your packaging, in your social feeds, on your website, to see what is the overall message that's conveyed to consumers.
And in terms of retailers like Sephora or Ulta or Credo, what is their responsibility in terms of if a consumer posts something on the product that has, let's say acne or some sort of flagged word? Is that the responsibility still of the brand, or is that the responsibility of the reseller or the retailer?
So brands do not have responsibility for claims that are made on websites that they do not control. However, it is a very good practice for brands with their retailers to be monitoring what claims are being made by retailers. So, a consumer review on a retailer's website is going to be considered the retailer's claim about the product. And, retailers don't have nearly as much insight into or monitoring of the claims, for each individual brand's product. And so it really is a best practice for brands to monitor what claims are being made by retailers and or consumers on retailer websites. We aren't responsible as a brand. We're not responsible for the claims that are posted there, but it is a best practice to monitor and police those claims. So you can say, hey, we reached out to our retailer. We saw that claim. We reached out to our retailer and we said, this isn't accurate. We don't have substantiation for this. We need you to take this claim down. What the retailer does after that is up to them. But then the brand has done everything that it can do to ensure that the claims that are out there about its products are true and substantiate.
That's a good segue into responsibilities and oversight and where each of those lie.
Right. So claims are regulated by very many laws and different regulatory bodies, as you see here. And I think we largely think of the FDA as the regulator for cosmetic claims, but it isn't the only one. So claims are also regulated by the FTC, which has broad responsibility for all advertising, not just of cosmetics. And then there's a lesser known body called the National Advertising Division, which is a private entity. It is not a government entity, but it is the advertising industry's self-regulatory body. And it does partner with the FTC. So if you decline to work with the NAD, they may actually refer the issue to the FTC for government oversight. So all of these three, entities can regulate claims at a national level, but the real biggie is consumer attorneys. And I think a lot of times we don't think about them because they're not technically a regulator. In fact, they really are the regulator because the consequences of having consumer litigation are just so much more consequential for brands. And you're so much more likely to encounter litigation versus regulatory enforcement by, a federal agency. So these are the big four, I think. And of course, there are other state laws that brands have to consider, which we won't have time to talk about today. There's a lot there. But the FDA the FDA is really where
maybe you're
going to
get into this.
Yeah, go ahead. Hit me with your question.
I was curious, and maybe this is leading into it. The oversight that the FDA or the FTC has in terms of enforcement. I know with MOCRA, the FDA will have the ability to recall product, but what does the FDA and FTC currently have in terms of their ability to, send cease and desist letters, really enforce when they see something or investigate something?
Right. So the FDA typically, when they see an issue, they'll send a warning letter. That's the first thing that you will hear. If the FDA is looking at your website, sees some claims that it has concerns about, it's going to send a warning letter. Those warning letters are public and they will be posted on FDA's website. A warning letter is simply a letter that tells you to stop doing something and then you're going to stop doing it. So what are the consequences of that? You may need to change your packaging if the claims of concern are, if they appear on your labeling. But, maybe the claims are really just on your website, and then it's a very much easier fix to take them down off of your website, which is one reason why I recommend usually, if you're going to go out on a limb, maybe do it online instead of on your packaging, be a little bit more conservative on the packaging, right? But the warning letters are public. And then often what can happen is consumer attorneys see them, and then you've got follow-on litigation. So that can be a risk of having a warning letter.
And if you have to change the label, is there any communication that you need to provide to the consumer regarding inaccurate claims?
No, there's no obligation to explain why you've changed your packaging necessarily. It would be different if it were a recall situation, right? You might, in a recall, there might be some obligation to provide notice to consumers depending on what the issue was, if it was a safety issue. But if you're just changing your claims because the FDA is concerned that it's a structure function claim, then no, there isn't necessarily any obligation to notify consumers individually. Although, of course, you may get questions about it. And a lot of what I see in my day-to-day is fielding questions from brands about, hey, we got a question from a consumer about this. How do we respond? And so, if you are going to be changing your packaging in a significant way, it's a good idea to have a plan as to how to field those kinds of questions. All right. So the FDA is a biggie, and they've got, there are several laws that regulate claims here. And they regulate claims based on the category of the product, right? So cosmetics are regulated very differently from drugs or dietary supplements, et cetera. And there are really significant differences based on product category in what the FDA thinks you're allowed to say about the product. And that distinction is very important because typically what we see is that brands want to make all kinds of claims about what their products can really do. And unfortunately, the law is a little bit behind the times because it does not necessarily recognize that cosmetics can really change the skin or the hair or, whatever the product does. So I think our technology is ahead of where the FDA really recognizes what cosmetics can and should do. And so this is reflected really in the definitions of what is a cosmetic versus a drug. And I'm going to put those up here. So a cosmetic is an article that's intended to be applied to the body, and it's going to function either for cleansing, beautifying, or promoting the general appearance of the wearer. It's not intended for drug functions, which would be to treat, mitigate, or prevent disease. So there's sort of this gray area because it's very clear what's a disease claim, right? You might see a claim for a skincare product that says great for rosacea or moisturize and treat eczema, reduce itching, associated with psoriasis, things like that. So those are very clearly and expressly disease claims. They are drug claims. But where you kind of have questions is when you are talking about claims that a product can affect the structure or the function of the skin, right? And we call those structure function claims. And a lot of brands evidence that their products can impact the structure or the function of the skin. And they want to say things that they, have substantiation for, but those things can run afoul of the FDA's definition of what a cosmetic is, because the FDA will tell you that, a structure function claim is a drug claim, and you can make your product into an unapproved drug simply by advertising it as able to impact the structure and function of the skin.
In looking at the definitions that the FDA has established, to me, it seems a little vague and unclear in terms of altering appearance and this concept of structure function. So altering one's appearance, or even the, and I do like that the language still says, improving attractiveness. I think that dates it in and of itself. But in terms of that language that is used, do you think it's explicit enough to brands or even yourself to really have a clear distinction when a claim is potentially, if it doesn't involve stating a disease, what is that kind of fuzzy area that this language maybe does not help to support?
Well, I will tell you that I've been doing this a long time, so I don't anymore have any difficulty telling you what I think is a structure function claim versus a cosmetic claim. At the end of the day, you have to ask, does the claim talk about the look or the feel of the skin, hair, or the body? Because at the end of the day, the FDA is looking to see, what is it you intend to do with this product? Are you intending to enhance the attractiveness of the wearer, or are you intending to change the structure or the function of the body? Now, oftentimes a claim is really saying both of those at the same time. And right, so you might be saying, get a youthful look by applying peptides that reduce free radicals, something like that.
Yeah. Improve skin barrier function.
Right. In that claim, you're talking about something that is occurring in the structure of the skin. Anytime you talk about cells or follicles, you're talking about structures of the skin and the hair. So that can be an area where you're starting to push the envelope. And it can be very difficult. I think what we see a lot is that brands want to show consumers how their products work, because consumers are so hungry to understand kind of the science. They want to know that this is real and it really works. And so there is a lot of consumer demand and brand interest in sharing the science behind the product. But actually, sometimes that is exactly where the rubber meets the road with respect to turning your perfectly good cosmetic claim into a drug claim. It can be very difficult to explain sometimes the science behind your efficacy in a way that doesn't run afoul of that. And so a lot of times brands just have to make a business judgment about whether they want to take that risk or not.
And so when it comes to claim substantiation, what are some of the legal standards for substantiating a claim?
So advertising claims and substantiation are really regulated by the FTC, where, you've got to make sure that your advertising is truthful and separately not misleading. Even a truthful claim can, in some circumstances, be misleading. And that means that you have to have support for your claim before you make it. Before you make the advertising claim, you're required to have that support. You have to have a reasonable basis for saying what you're saying. And if you have to, make some kind of disclosure about the claim to make it truthful, that disclosure has to be clear and conspicuous. Actually, the FTC has recently said it needs to be unavoidable, because now, so many consumers are shopping on their phones. You shouldn't have to be able to scroll down to see some small asterisk disclosure at the bottom in order to get truthful information. Even a claim that omits something that's important can be misleading. So you need to keep that in mind as you're formulating your claims. And then the way to formulate substantiated claims is to look at what your support is. So substantiation is claims driven. I get the question all the time, how much do I need? What do I need to prove my claim? And it really depends on what the claim is. So I've got on my slide this list of claims. Some of them are clearly disease claims, right? Treats skin cancer, prevents cold and flu. These are disease claims. And to make those kinds of claims, you're really selling a drug and you've got to have a lot of support. But getting below that, right? If you are talking about clinical tests that prove product does something, well, then you've got to have clinical tests that actually prove your product does something. And a lot of times we see brands wanting to make numerical claims. Those kinds of claims really do need to have clinical support because you have to ask yourself, does the consumer have the ability to evaluate the truthfulness of this statement? And if the answer to that is no, you really probably do need to have clinical support as opposed to, let's say, consumer perception studies. You may, in some cases, need survey evidence, right? If you're saying 4 out of 5 dermatologists recommend, well, then you better have a survey. But if it's a claim like, this product makes your skin soft and smooth, well, that is a claim that a consumer can more easily determine the truthfulness of themselves. And so that's something where you can ask consumers who've used the product, did this make your skin soft and smooth? And then last but not least, you've got the kinds of claims that really don't require any support at all because we would call them in the business puffery, right? So you'd say a claim that, your product comes in 3 delightful scents. Well, you want to make sure you have support that it does have 3 different scents, but are they delightful? That's subjective. It's an opinion and you don't have to support that with anything. So the legal standard, substantiation, is really what a scientist would say is reliable and accurate about the product and the claim. So, when people come to me and say, hey, is this enough substantiation? Or what do you think of my substantiation? Often what I'm doing is just evaluating the scientific reliability of the data. And I'm trying to think, if I were attacking this, what would I say about it? So I look at things like, are there enough subjects in your study? Did you achieve statistical significance? Is this test even relevant to the claim that you're making, right? So maybe you're relying on testing done by an ingredient supplier, and they've tested the active ingredient at 2%, but it's only in your formula at 1%. Well, that test isn't really that relevant then to supporting your claim because you don't have enough active in the product to rely on that study. So those are the kinds of things that, you need to be thinking about when you're evaluating your support.
Okay, real quick. Raise your hand if you have dealt with active instability. If you have ever opened a jar of retinol cream and smelt an off odor or noticed your formula went dark brown, chances are you are dealing with active instability. It's never fun when the formula you've been working on goes south and the due date is only days away. That's why we've encapsulated the trickier ingredients to work with so you can kick the stability struggle to the curb. From retinol to vitamin C, we make it easier to work with those ingredients that typically give you that 3 p.m. headache. The cellulose shell shields the active from outside exposure. Things like air and light that are likely to cause active breakdown, giving you the power to create stable and effective formulas without the trial and error. Ready to quickly create effective skincare formulas? Discover Tagra's Cellucaps line by going to tagra.com/cellucaps. So, have you encapsulated yet? Now back to the show.
So the ingredient example is an interesting one. I have in the past seen brands that are willing to make claims based on a raw material vendor's evidence, given it's in a different product formulation. In terms of those claims, how how do they adhere to the legal standard if you are making a claim on a product based on an ingredient supplier's data?
Well, again, you have to look at the totality of your evidence, right? So the first question is this the only evidence you have? Let's say you're making a claim that your skincare product, which uses, an ingredient, like a hydrating ingredient like collagen, right? It contains plant collagen, let's say. And you're just making a moisturizing claim about that. And that's based on your ingredient supplier's information about the active. The first thing I would say is never, ever rely solely on an ingredient brochure, because that is advertising. It is not test data. And, if you get sued by a consumer attorney who says your product doesn't actually do what you say it does, and your only evidence to back up your claim is an ingredient supplier's brochure, you're in trouble. So for that reason, I would say if you want to rely on testing data supplied by an ingredient supplier, you need to ask them for the underlying data. Sometimes they're willing to share that. Sometimes they aren't. Before you contract with them, you should find out if they are going to help you out with your support by providing that testing data. Because, I would have concerns about ingredient suppliers who don't want to share the underlying data with me, right? So that's one thing. But let's say you do get that underlying testing data. There might be no reason at all that you can't rely on it. Your product contains the same amount of active that they tested, the same or more. If your target market is similar to the kinds of subjects that they tested, if the administration of your product is the same as what they did in the test. So, for example, I see this sometimes with dietary supplements. A lot of times, dietary supplements will rely on ingredient information, testing of the ingredient for their support, but maybe they're looking at studies where that ingredient was applied topically, and with their product, you're going to ingest it. So that's another thing you need to think about. Maybe you're selling a hair care product, and you're looking at testing where the active ingredient was applied and left on, but your product is a rinse out. Well, that's important to know. And so those are the kinds of things you need to evaluate if you're going to rely on someone else's study. But relying on someone else's study of an active ingredient is never going to be as strong support as testing your own finished product. And that's because it will always be subject to the attack that, well, this is just the active ingredient, and you have no idea actually what your product does when you add in all of the other ingredients.
When it comes to product versus ingredient claims, can you rely on supplier data for ingredient claims only? I think a good example is antioxidant, right? A lot of the brands with antioxidant claims will call out the ingredient, and it's only specific to that ingredient, not the product. Can you talk a little bit about that distinction between ingredient claims versus product claims?
If you are calling out a key ingredient and you're saying that the ingredient does X, then you want support that shows that ingredient is responsible for that benefit. And for that, you certainly can rely on an ingredient supplier's data, assuming that it shows that, right? Even if you are making a product and you're relying on ingredient support, that can be okay too. Because the truth is, let's say you are calling out a key ingredient and you say, this key ingredient does this, that is an implied claim that your product does the same thing. So you might say, key ingredient, vitamin C brightens the skin. Well, that's an implied claim that your product brightens the skin. And so you're going to have to not only show, right, that the ingredient brightens the skin, but also that the product itself brightens the skin. And that's why it's so important to be able to generalize information from your ingredient testing to the product. Your ingredient testing might show that vitamin C brightens the skin. The problem is, what if it does that at 5% and you've only got 1%? right? So you want to be able to make the connections between the ingredient that was tested and what's actually in your product and how it's to be used in order to make sure that the data is generalizable to your product.
Earlier, you mentioned if a brand were to potentially make a riskier claim, that they might want to do it on their website because it's easier to remove than, say, like on pack. When we talk about risk, I know part of what you also provide is a risk assessment matrix. Can you talk a little bit about how brands start to think about risk and the level of risk that they're willing to take, and what levers do they look at in terms of assessing that risk?
Sure. Really, when you think about risk, you want to think about all of the things on that, first slide list: FDA, FTC, NAD, consumer attorneys. So you have to look at, number one, do I have a drug claim here for my cosmetic? You want to start hopefully with a real cosmetic. And then you need to look at your claim, however you've, maybe it's a cosmetic claim, maybe you're making some structure function claims, maybe you're trying to kind of have a balancing act, right? Where on your packaging, you've been more conservative, you're pushing the envelope on a few really important claims to you on your website. But now you need to look and see, okay, if we're taking some risks here with what the FDA is going to say, let's make sure that we're really good on substantiation. And that's what I often will say is you might take some risk relative to whether the FDA is going to think you are making a structured function claim. But if you're taking risk in one area, you want to be really strong elsewhere. And it's really always critically important to have support and substantiation for the truthfulness of your claims, because that is where the consumer attorneys come in, right? These 4 ways to look at claims through the eyes of, the FDA, the FTC, the NAD, and consumer attorneys, there's really a lot of overlap. So you want to make sure you have support and substantiation, because maybe a consumer attorney sees your kind of risky structure function claim, and that attracts their attention. And they say, hey, you're selling an unapproved drug, and also it doesn't do what you say it does. There are legal defenses to those kinds of claims, but you want to be able to rely on the fact that you've done this testing and you've got solid support that your product actually does what it says it does. So you have to look at sort of the totality of what you're doing, not just each individual claim, but all of the claims together. And what is the message that you're conveying to consumers? How are regulators going to see that message? And is it going to attract unwanted attention from consumer attorneys? Is it going to attract unwanted attention from competitors, right? A lot of times you might be making a comparative claim. Our product is, 10 times better than the next thing on the market. And that's where you would need to kind of think a little bit about the NAD, because it is a self-regulatory body and it is used by brands really to resolve disputes without going to court. And for that, it can be really a great forum because it's cheaper than litigation, it's extremely fast, and you get really good analysis by the NAD, by really capable attorneys there. So it can be a great forum if, let's say, you have a competitor who is making a claim that you think is false. You can challenge that there. But you also need to be aware that the NAD has its own monitoring program, and they're keeping an eye out on, what you're doing too. And they might by themselves take up an issue with you. And we've seen that with things like before and after photographs, customer reviews, ingredient claims, and superiority claims. If you're saying that your product is superior to somebody else's, you might get a challenge from a competitor. So these are all the kinds of things that you need to be thinking about when you're devising your claims. And then, of course, you need to think about consumer attorneys as well, because just as there are trends in beauty, there are trends in consumer litigation. And I can talk about that.
How much? Yeah, we can, yes. But how much does, and I hate that I'm saying this, but how much does brand size and reach also factor into that risk assessment matrix. So I've heard a lot of times, a brand make a decision because we're too small, we're not on a radar. Is that something that goes into a risk assessment?
It can, but it is not foolproof. So I would say that, yes, if you are a big brand, you are a much richer target for consumer litigation, right? If, you've got a lot of exposure, maybe you're working with a celebrity, lots of people know, maybe you just got funded and there's a lot of press about that. All of those things are the types of things that consumer attorneys are keeping an eye on. And if they think that, there's money to be had, you may be a target for consumer litigation. So that is something to consider. At the same time, though, being a small brand is not going to insulate you from risk either, because a lot of times consumer attorneys cannot tell that you're a mom and pop shop. They have no idea. Your website looks amazing, and they see that people like your brand and you're popular on social media. So, it's really not, it's not going to prevent you from sometimes having to deal with consumer demands and litigation. And so, you really do need to make a risk calculus. But I would tell you that as a rule, the bigger you get, the more success you have, the more inevitable it is that you will be sued.
Let's talk a little bit about that. So when it comes to class action lawsuits, how does that start? Is this a consumer that reaches out to a consumer lawyer? Or like you said, there are trends, right? And they're looking. And so a consumer lawyer may find something that they find to be duplicitous. And then do they say, who are the consumers that are using this? Let's find them.
Yeah. So I think there are a couple things to consider here. First, absolutely, you might have a consumer who, is upset for whatever reason and thinks they have a claim, and they can reach out and find an attorney. And that does happen, which is why I think it's extremely important when a consumer reaches out to you and has some kind of a complaint that you address that carefully and, not just rely on your customer support team who maybe just has like boilerplate scripts and doesn't really necessarily know what to do. So it's important to elevate those, because even if your consumer has a bad experience with your product, you want them to have a good customer service experience. And that can go a long way in preventing litigation. But probably more or less, class actions originate with class action attorneys who advertise for plaintiffs. And they do that the same way that brands look for customers, right? They're on social media too. And they're using analytics too. So I actually have known...
They obviously don't pop up on my social media.
Well, you would be surprised, because if you are a person like I am, who looks at a lot of brands' websites and is, looking at a lot of cosmetics web pages, you might get served an ad from a class action attorney who's looking for plaintiffs. So that's how that works. And those kinds of situations are where you see the trends arise, because, an attorney might create a lawsuit for one plaintiff and decide, this is a good case and I want to bring it again and again and again. And then they just need to find more plaintiffs in different places with new products, and they can kind of have an economy of scale and reuse the work they've already done to bring class actions, really against the whole industry.
And so when it comes to these trends, I see you have a few listed here, and I think you might have some subsequent slides on it. What are some of the emerging trends that you've observed class action lawsuits filed for?
So we're seeing a lot happening in the way of green claims and ingredient claims, and then lots of marketing tools. So greenwashing is a really big concern, because, of course, there's so much consumer demand for green claims, and brands are responding to that demand. And they're making green claims, but a lot of the terminology that is being used out there is not defined by any regulatory body. And so it's kind of up for debate. What does it mean when you say that your product is sustainable? Maybe what you mean is that it's in recyclable packaging, but a consumer might think that it means, your carbon emissions are net zero. And so if you're just saying sustainable, there's a lot of ambiguity and a lot of room for misunderstanding. And so you have to really be careful about what you are saying. I advise to make narrow, specific claims for which you have very solid substantiation because, natural is a term that has been litigated for probably like 15 years or more. There's still no definition from FDA. There's still no definition from any regulatory body. Nobody wants to take that on. And so, there are ISO standards for cosmetics on natural. If you want to make a natural claim, you ought to take a look at those and be very familiar and have very solid substantiation because it's, a target claim. But we're seeing lots of new claims, with respect to carbon offsets, recyclable content. That's going to be a really big one. Actually, California a couple of years ago enacted a law that is going to make it illegal to make any kind of recyclability claim unless your packaging is made of a material that is actually recycled in majority of counties in California. So the statute itself, lists the claims that you see here, a chasing arrows symbol, eco-friendly green product. Please recycle implies that the packaging can be recycled. And California is saying, look, if we don't recycle that packaging, if we don't have facilities in the state of California to recycle that packaging, you can't say that. This is something where we're going to see a lot of litigation because it is going to become per se illegal to make these claims. And then it's going to be very easy for consumer attorneys to bring consumer protection. So you'll want to check the material characterization study that California put out and make sure your packaging is actually recycled here in the state, including you need to be thinking about, any dyes, any adhesives, any component of the product that may not be recyclable, can prevent you from being able to legally make the claim. So that's kind of some of the big stuff that's happening with green claims.
Yeah. And I guess just out of curiosity, in terms of, for instance, I came across a material for deodorants that's a silver lactate. It is prohibited in the EU, the Philippines, Japan, those countries. And so brands that are using it just choose not to go into those countries. But let's say if California enacts this law and a brand still has what they believe is a recyclable product that maybe doesn't adhere to this material characterization, is there the ability to not distribute into California?
Sure. If you want to make a recyclability claim on a package that California doesn't recycle, you could simply not sell it in California. That would be a way to get around that. But I can't think of any brands who want to not sell in California.
Yes, I can definitely see that. I guess just in terms of that, the legality, is it brands that are entering in there directly, especially given a lot of e-commerce, how exactly does one state law impact national brands?
Right. Well, typically, though, what happens is it's not just one state law. And we're seeing that with the extended producer responsibility laws that are being passed. So brands that sell nationally are going to need to figure out how to harmonize their distribution and comply with various state laws. So right now, California is this one with the truth in recycling law. California also enacted an EPR law, right, which is going to require a certain amount of post-consumer recyclable content in the package. It's going to, force less plastic and more recycling over time. But California is not the only state that's doing this, and we're going to be seeing it in Europe as well. So these are trends that we're seeing across the industry around the world. And I think brands need to be thinking long-term about these issues. It's one thing to decide, okay, I'm not going to sell in California this year because I'm not prepared to comply with this law yet. But long-term strategy, I would say, is you're going to have to figure out how to do it because these laws are not going away and they're just going to spread across the US. So another trend we're seeing is ingredient claims in class actions where maybe you're making free of claims. Those can be risky because it's very hard to prove that your product has zero of something. Maybe it's made without or formulated without sulfates or parabens or something like that. In which case, I would recommend you make that claim made without or formulated without. But whenever you say free or zero, then you subject your product to possible testing. And there might be a contaminant in your product that you're not aware of because you don't do finished product testing of every batch of your product for these particular contaminants. Why would you test for them when you don't put them in there? So the problem is that there can be contamination from, tubing during the manufacturing process. There can be contamination from your packaging. There can be all kinds of issues, even the plants that you use because you're touting a plant-based product. Those plants grow in the environment and they can be absorbing all kinds of contaminants from the ground. So free of claims are, I think, a trap. And we've seen a lot of litigation around that.
So in terms of free from or free of claims, if you are doing the testing, can you say that if you are below the detectable limit? So, a lot of these tests sometimes they actually have pretty low thresholds for detection. But if your product is adhering to that, does that become less risky and is it a viable claim?
Yeah, if you can say almost anything you want if you have support. Obviously, it has to be a legal claim, right? But if you can prove it, great. But there is risk, right? So that's the thing. You're never going to have a zero risk claim. And when you say anything hyperbolic, 0 or 100%, you open yourself up to that one freaky, fluky thing where there's some exception. And then you can have litigation from that. We're seeing that kind of issue arise where consumer attorneys and labs are testing products on the market. And I don't know if you heard about, there's been a lot of testing by this lab called Valisure, who claim to be independent. I think there is some debate about that. But they've tested all kinds of products in the beauty industry. So the latest is acne products, which is an OTC drug. But they've also tested dry shampoo and sunscreens and antifungal sprays. And they've, purported to find all kinds of contaminants in these products. And that also spawns mass litigation. And that can be, an issue for brands and for contract manufacturers who are making the products. And so it's really important to be testing if there are any concerns about possible contamination. And then to ensure that you have good contracts with your partners to provide for what's going to happen if something like that occurs. Who's responsible? But that's not, you need to think about your packaging. You need to think about your formulation. But you also really need to be thinking about your marketing because that's also increasingly getting scrutiny from consumer attorneys. And we're seeing that because of the rise in privacy laws in the United States. So, a slew of comprehensive privacy laws have passed in many states. And California is really leading the charge and has established a new agency to enforce those privacy laws. And it so happens that Sephora was the first company against whom there was enforcement by the California Attorney General. And so this is absolutely impacting our industry. And, you need to be thinking about what your marketing department is doing. So if you're, using analytics, if you're using pixel tracking, if you're doing advertising across different devices, cross-context behavioral advertising, you need to be thinking about whether you're making the right privacy disclosures, because we're seeing a lot of litigation in that area as well. The plaintiff's bar has really been using old laws to bring creative new claims to address evolving and new technologies. So we're seeing, claims under the Video Privacy Protection Act, which was enacted in the 80s. And it related to, rental of videotapes, those VHS cassettes. But now we're seeing that being wielded around videos that you might be posting on your website. And if you can see whether a particular consumer viewed a video, that can be an issue. We're seeing a lot of lawsuits around wiretapping statutes in California. So that's an issue. And then you might be employing cool AI tools, right? Maybe you're looking at facial recognition, maybe a try-on tool, something like that. But that also can subject you to litigation with respect to whether you've made appropriate disclosures. And then, of course, text message marketing, which is an oldie but a goodie now. And we're still seeing quite a lot of litigation around that because there are very specific disclosures that you need to make if you're doing that. So there's been a lot of litigation in all of those areas with respect to different marketing techniques. And there's just a huge intersection between marketing and privacy. But I would say those are the big trends that we're seeing.
Everything we've talked about highlights the need to have a robust claim and regulatory strategy. For small brands that maybe don't have extensive resources, what advice would you give them?
Well, my advice would be that I know it can be overwhelming, but not to be overwhelmed because you can take it one step at a time. So the thing to do is to just identify what the priorities are and create a list and start at the top and work your way through it as you can. Nobody expects that compliance is going to be something you can do all at once. But, the longer you practice at it, the better you'll get at it and the more risk mitigation you're going to enjoy. So my advice is simply to not be overwhelmed, take it one thing at a time and keep at it.
Thank you again for your time. And we have the slide up here where if anyone has any questions, they can reach out directly to you.
They sure can. Thanks for having me.